This is an opportunity for me to start reading books to you. I love reading books, and I want to read these books to you because you're so important to me. And so I'm reading this book for you because I want you to be blessed and to know the Lord. This is only for my son. It's only for Caleb. This isn't for anybody else. But the book I want to read is called Disappointment with God by Philip Yancey. He really answers three questions that nobody really wants to ask, and yet he goes about it in such a way where you feel like someone's listening to where you've been, what you've been through, and what you're going through. And so that's really why I want to read these books, and there's just for you, my darling son. And so I'm reading this for you. Hopefully that you will just be blessed, okay? Your heart be healed. All right, so we're going to start with Disappointment with God by Philip Yancey. He wrote it in 1988. And we're just going to get started, okay? I'm going to start with the preface, and I'm going to have to turn on this light, I'm sorry. It's kind of going to be bright. Oh boy, very bright. Okay. The preface is, after I had begun work on this project, I received phone calls from a few people in my church who had heard about it. Is it true you're writing a book about disappointment with God? The callers would ask. If so, I'd like to talk. I haven't told anyone before, but my life as a Christian has included times of great disappointment. I did interview some of those callers, and their stories helped me set the direction of this book. I found that for many people there's a large gap between what they expect from the Christian faith and what they actually experience. From a steady diet of books, sermons, and personal testimonies, all promising triumph and success, they learn to expect dramatic evidence of God working in their lives. If they do not see such evidence, they feel disappointment, betrayal, and often guilt. As one woman said, I kept hearing the phrase, personal relationship with Jesus Christ, but I found to my dismay that it is unlike any other personal relationship. I never saw God, or heard him, or felt him, or experienced the most basic ingredients of a relationship. Either there's something wrong with what I was told, or there's something wrong with me. Disappointment occurs when the actual experience of something falls far short of what we anticipate. For that reason, the first half of this book explores the Bible to see what we can rightly expect from God. I hesitated to start there, since I know that some people, especially disappointed people, have little tolerance for the Bible. But what better place to begin than by letting God speak for himself? I tried to rid myself of preconceptions and read the Bible like a story with a plot. What I found there astonished me. It was very different from the story I had been told most of my life. Actually, I set out to write 2 different books, and did so, but I ended up putting them both between the same covers. Book 2 moves to a more practical, existential issues and applies the ideas I have developed to actual situations, the kinds of situations that foster disappointment with God. Ultimately, I concluded that the 2 approaches belonged in the same book. Either would be incomplete on its own. Once as I explained this project to a friend, he frowned and shook his head. I guess I've never tried to psychoanalyze God before, he said. I hope that's not what I'm attempting, but I do wish to understand God better, to learn why he sometimes acts in such mysterious ways, or does not seem to act at all. A few words of caution, however. This is not a book of apologetics, so I will not travel the path of pointing out evidences for God. Others have done that effectively, and besides, I'm dealing with doubts that are more emotional than intellectual. Disappointment implies a hoped-for relationship that somehow has not worked out. Nor will I debate the question, does God ever perform miracles? I take for granted that he has supernatural power and has used it. Yes, God can intervene. So why doesn't he do so more often? Why handicap himself among sincere skeptics who would like to believe if only they had a sign? Why permit injustice and suffering to thrive on earth? Why aren't God's interventions ordinaries rather than miracles? One last caution. By no means am I presenting a balanced view of the Christian faith. I am, after all, writing for people who have, at one time or another, heard the silence of God. Studying someone like Job as an example of faith is a little like studying the history of civilization by examining only the wars. On the other hand, there are many Christian books that leave out any mention of the wars and promise nothing but victory. This is a book about faith, but it looks at faith through the eyes of those who doubt. And finally, I should explain the way I have chosen to handle Bible references. I resisted putting them in footnotes or parentheses within the text. That creates an awkwardness in reading, not unlike listening to someone with a stutter. Instead, I have indicated the sources of direct citations at the end of each chapter. True sleuths should be able to track down the correct passage. Okay, so here we go. Disappointment with God. Okay. It says, "Awake, O Lord! Why do you sleep? Rouse yourself! Do not reject us forever! Why do you hide your face?" Psalm 44, 23, and 24. God within the shadows. Book 1. You do not have to sit outside in the dark. If, however, you want to look at the stars, you will find that darkness is required. The stars neither require it nor demand it. That's a quote by Annie Dillard. Part 1. Hearing the Silence. Chapter 1, A Fatal Error. Ever since my book, Where is God When It Hurts, was published, I have received letters from people disappointed with God. A young mother wrote that her joy had turned to bitterness and grief when she delivered a daughter with spina bifida, a birth defect that leaves the spinal cord exposed. In page after page of tiny, spidery script, she recounted how medical bills had soaked up the family savings and how her marriage had cracked apart as her husband came to resent all the time she devoted to their sick child. As her life crumbled around her, she was beginning to doubt what she had once believed about a loving God. Did I have any advice? A homosexual spilled out his story gradually in a succession of letters. For more than a decade he had sought a cure for his sexual orientation, trying charismatic healing services, Christian support groups, and chemical treatment. He even underwent a form of aversion therapy in which psychologists applied electrical shocks to his genitals when he responded to erotic photos of men. Nothing worked. Finally, he surrendered to a life of gay promiscuity. He still writes me occasionally. He insists that he wants to follow God, but he feels disqualified because of his peculiar curse. A young woman wrote with some embarrassment about her ongoing depression. She has no reason to be depressed, she said. She is healthy, earns a good salary, and has a stable family background. Yet on most days when she wakes up, she cannot think of a single reason to go on living. She no longer cares about life or God, and when she prays, she wonders if anyone is really listening. These and other letters I have received over the years all lead up to the same basic question, phrased in different ways. It goes something like this. Your book is about physical pain, but what about pain like mine? Where is God when I hurt emotionally? What does the Bible say about that? I answered the letters as best I can, sadly conscious of the inadequacy of words on paper. Can a word, any word, ever heal a wound? And I must confess that after reading these anguished accounts, I asked the very same question. Where is God in our emotional pain? Why does he so often disappoint us? Disappointment with God does not come only in dramatic circumstances. For me, it also edges unexpectedly in the mundaneness of everyday life. I remember one night last winter, a cold, raw Chicago night. The wind was howling and sleet slanted out of the skies, coating the streets with darkly shining ice. That night my car stalled in a rather ominous neighborhood. As I raised the hood and hunched over the engine, the sleet stinging my back like tiny pebbles, I prayed over and over, "Please help me get this car started." No amount of fiddling with wires and tubes and cables would start the car, and so I spent the next hour in a dilapidated diner, waiting for a tow truck. Sitting on a plastic chair, my drenched clothes forming a widening pool of water around me, I wondered what God thought about my plight. I would miss a scheduled meeting that night and would probably waste many hours of the next few days trying to wring fair, honest work out of a service station set up to prey upon stranded motorists. Did God even care about my frustration or the waste of energy and money? Like the woman embarrassed over her depression, I feel ashamed even to mention such an unanswered prayer. It seems petty and selfish, maybe even stupid, to pray for a car to start. But I have found that petty disappointments tend to accumulate over time, undermining my faith with a lava flow of doubt. I start to wonder whether God cares about everyday details, about me. I am tempted to pray less often, having concluded in advance that it won't matter. Or will it? My emotions and my faith waver. Once Once the doubts seep in, I'm even less prepared for times of major crisis. A neighbor is dying of cancer. I pray diligently for her. But even as I pray, I wonder, can God be trusted? If so many small prayers go unanswered, what about the big ones? One morning in a motel room, I switched on the television, and the square, jowly face of a well-known evangelist filled the screen. "I'm mad at God," he said, glowering. It was a remarkable confession from a man who had built his career around the notion of seed faith and absolute confidence in God's personal concern. But God had let him down, he said, and went on to explain. God had commanded him to build a large ministry complex, and yet the project proved to be a financial disaster, forcing him to sell off properties and cut back programs. He had kept his part of the bargain, but God had not. A few weeks later, I saw the evangelist on television, this time exuding faith and optimism. He leaned toward the camera, his craggy face splitting into a big grin, and jabbed his finger toward the million viewers. "Something good is going to happen to you this week," he said, coaxing 3 syllables out of the word good. He was at his salesman best, utterly convincing. A few days later, however, I heard on the news that his son had committed suicide. I could not help wondering what the evangelist said to God in his prayers that fateful week. Such struggles seem almost to mock the triumphant slogans about God's love and personal concern that I often hear in Christian churches. Yet no one is immune to the downward spiral of disappointment. It happens to people like the televangelists and to people like the letter writers, and it happens to ordinary Christians. First comes disappointment, then a seed of doubt, then a response of anger or betrayal. We begin to question whether God is trustworthy, whether we can really stake our lives on him. I've been thinking about this topic of disappointment with God for a long time, but I hesitated to write about it for 2 reasons. First, I knew I would have to confront questions that have no easy answers, that may, in fact, have no answers. And second, I did not want to write a book that would, by focusing on failure, dampen anyone's faith. Some Christians I know would reject the phrase disappointment with God out of hand. Such a notion is all wrong, they say. Jesus promised that faith the size of a grain of mustard seed can move mountains, that anything can happen if 2 or 3 gather together in prayer. The Christian life is a life of victory and triumph. God wants us happy, healthy, and prosperous, and any other state simply indicates a lack of faith. During a visit among people who believe exactly this, I finally reached the decision to write this book. I was investigating the topic of physical healing for a magazine assignment, and the research led me to a rather infamous church headquartered in rural Indiana. I had learned of the church from a Chicago Tribune series and from a special report on ABC's Nightline program. Members of this church believed that simple faith could heal any disease, and that to look elsewhere for help, for example to medical doctors, demonstrated a lack of faith in God. The Tribune articles told of parents who had looked on helplessly as their children fought losing battles with meningitis or pneumonia or a common flu virus, diseases that easily could have been treated. On a map of the United States, a Tribune artist had drawn tiny tombstone symbols to mark where people had died after refusing medical treatment in accordance with church teaching. There were 52 tombstones in all. According to the reports, pregnant women in that church died in childbirth at a rate 8 times the national average, and young children were 3 times more likely to die. Yet the church was growing and had established branches in 19 states and 5 foreign countries. I visited the mother church in Indiana on a sweltering August day. Heat waves shimmied off the asphalt roads, and parched brown cornstalks drooped in the fields. The building sat unmarked in the midst of one of those cornfields, huge, isolated like a misplaced barn. In the parking lot, I had to talk my way past 2 ushers with walkie-talkies. The church was nervous about publicity, especially since former members had recently filed lawsuits. I suppose I expected a sign of fanaticism during the service, a swooning, hypnotic sermon delivered by a Jim Jones-type preacher. I saw nothing like that. For 90 minutes, 700 of us sitting in a large semicircle sang hymns and studied the Bible. I was among simple people. The women wore dresses or skirts, no slacks, and used little makeup. The men, dressed in shirts and ties, sat with their families and helped keep the children in line. Children were far more conspicuous here than in most churches. They were everywhere. Keeping quiet for 90 minutes stretches the limits of small child's endurance, and I watched the parents try to cope. Coloring books abounded. Mothers played games with their children's fingers. Some had brought along a treasure trove of toys and oversized pocketbooks. If I had come looking for sensationalism, I went away disappointed. I had a slice of old-fashioned Americana, where the traditional family was still alive and well. Parents there loved their children as much as any of us parents on earth. And yet, The map with the tiny tombstones leaped to mind. Some of those same parents had sat by the bedsides of their dying youngsters and done nothing. One father told the Tribune of his prayer vigil as he watched his 15-month-old son battle a fever for 2 weeks. The illness first caused deafness, then blindness. The pastor of the church urged even more faith and persuaded the father not to call a doctor. The next day the boy was dead. An autopsy revealed that he had died from an easily treatable form of meningitis. By and large, the members of the Indiana church do not blame God for their miseries, or at least they do not admit to doing so. Instead, they blame themselves for weak faith. Meanwhile, the tombstones multiply. I went away from that Sunday service with a profound conviction that what we think about God and believe about God really matters, as much as anything in life matters. Those people were not ogres or child murderers, and yet several dozen of their children had died because of an error, I believe, in theology. Actually, the teaching of the Indiana church is not so different from what I hear in many evangelical churches and on religious television and radio. They simply apply the extravagant promises of faith more consistently. Because of those sincere people in Indiana, along with the questioning people who had written to me, I decided to confront issues I am sorely tempted to avoid. Thus this book of theology, nor a technical book by any means, not a technical book by any means, but a book about the nature of God and why he sometimes acts in puzzling ways and sometimes does not act. We dare not confine theology to seminary coffee shops where professors and students play mental badminton. It affects all of us. Some people lose their faith because of a sharp sense of disappointment with God. They expect God to act a certain way, and God lets them down. Others may not lose their faith, but they too experience a form of disappointment. They believe God will intervene. They pray for a miracle, and their prayers come back unanswered. 52 times at least it happened that way in the Indiana church. Chapter 2. Up in Smoke. One afternoon my phone rang, and the caller identified himself as a theology student at Wheaton College Graduate School. "My name is Richard," he said. "We haven't met, but I feel a kinship with you because of some of your writings. Do you have a minute?" Richard proceeded to tell me about his life. He had become a Christian as a university student when an intervarsity worker befriended him and introduced him to the faith. Yet Richard hardly talked like a new Christian. Although he asked for my recommendation of Christian books, I found that he had already read each one I mentioned. We had a pleasant, wandering conversation, and not until the end of the call did I learn his real purpose and contact me. "I hate to bother you with this," he said nervously. "I know you're probably busy, but there is one favor I'd like to ask. You see, I wrote this paper on the book of Job, and my professor told me I should make a book out of it. Is there a chance you could take a look and see what you think?" I said yes, and the manuscript arrived within a few days. In truth, I did not expect much. Graduate school papers do not normally make compelling reading, and I doubted whether a relatively recent convert could come up with fresh insights on the daunting book of Job. But I was wrong. The manuscript showed real promise, and over the next few months Richard and I discussed by phone and mail how the paper could be reshaped into book form. A year later, with a finished manuscript and a signed contract in hand, Richard called to ask if I would write a foreword. I had still never met Richard, but I liked his enthusiasm, and he had written a book I could easily endorse. 6 months passed, during which the book went through final editing and revision. Then shortly before its publication date, Richard called yet again. His voice sounded different, tense, edgy. To my surprise, he fended off questions about his forthcoming book. "I need to see you, Philip," he said. "There's something I feel obligated to tell you, and it should be in person. Could I come over some afternoon this week?" Hot, hazy rays of sunlight streamed into my third-floor apartment. The open French doors had no screens, and flies buzzed in and out of the room. Richard, dressed in white tennis shorts and a T-shirt, sat on the couch across from me. Sweat glistened on his forehead. He had driven for an hour in heavy Chicago traffic for this meeting, and he first gulped down a glass of iced tea, trying to cool off. Richard was lean and in good physical shape, pure ectomorph, as an aerobics instructor might say. A bony face and short-cropped hair gave him the severe, intense look of a god-haunted monk. If body language speaks, he was voluble. His fists clenched and unclenched, his tanned legs crossed and uncrossed, and his facial muscles often tightened with tension. He skipped the small talk. "You've a right to be furious with me," he began. "I don't blame you a bit if you feel snookered." I had no idea what he meant. About what? "Well, it's like this. The book you helped me with, it's coming out next month, including your foreword. But the truth is, I don't believe what I wrote in that book anymore, and I feel I owe you an explanation." He paused for a moment, and I watched the lines of tension working in his jaw. "I hate God," he suddenly blurted out. "No, I don't mean that. I don't even believe in God." I said nothing. In fact, I saw very little for the next 3 hours as Richard I said very little for the next 3 hours as Richard told me his story, beginning with his parents' breakup. "I did everything I could to prevent the divorce," he said. "I'd just become a Christian at the university, and I was naive enough to believe that God cared. I prayed nonstop, day and night, that they'd get back together. I even dropped out of school for a while and went home to try to salvage my family. I thought I was doing God's will, but I think I made everything worse. It was my first bitter experience with unanswered prayer. I transferred to Wheaton College to learn more about the faith. I figured I must be doing something wrong. At Wheaton, I met people who used phrases like, 'I spoke with God,' and 'the Lord told me.' I sometimes talked like that too, but never without a twitch of guilt. Did the Lord really tell me anything? I never heard a voice or had any proof of God I could see or touch, yet I longed for that kind of closeness. Each time I faced a crucial decision, I would read the Bible and pray for guidance, like you're supposed to. Whenever I felt right about the decision, I would act on it. But I swear I ended up making the wrong choice every time. Just when I really thought I understood God's will, then it would backfire on me." Street noises drifted in, and I could hear neighbors going up and down the stairs, but these sounds did not distract Richard. He kept talking, and I nodded occasionally, though I still did not understand the reason for his almost violent outburst against God. Lots of families break up. Lots of prayers go unanswered. What was the true source of his molten rage? He next told me about a job opportunity that had fallen through. The employer reneged on a promise to him and hired someone less deserving, leaving Richard with school debts and no source of income. About the same time, Richard's fiancée jilted him. With no warning, she broke off contact, refusing to give any explanation for her abrupt change of heart. Sharon, the fiancée, had played a key role in Richard's spiritual growth, and as she left him, he felt some of his faith leach away as well. They had often prayed together about their future. Now those prayers seemed like cruel jokes. Richard had also a series of physical problems, which only added to his sense of helplessness and depression. Wounds of rejection, suffered when his parents had separated, seemed to reopen. Had God merely been stringing him along like Sharon? He visited a pastor for advice. He felt like a drowning man, he said. He wanted to trust God, but whenever he reached out, he grasped a fistful of air. Why should he keep believing in God so apparently unconcerned about... Why should he keep believing in a God so apparently unconcerned about his well-being? The pastor was barely sympathetic, and Richard got the clear impression that his own complaints did not measure up to the man's normal fare of broken marriages, cancer patients, alcoholics, and parents of wayward children. "When something straightens out with your girlfriend, you'll straighten out with God too," the pastor said with a condescending smile. To Richard, the problems were anything but minor. He could not understand why a loving Heavenly Father would let him suffer such disappointment. No earthly father would treat his child like that. He continued going to church, but inside him a hard lump of cynicism began forming, a tumor of doubt. The theology he had learned in school and had written about in his book no longer worked for him. It was odd, Richard told me, but the more anger I directed at God, the more energy I seemed to gain. I realized that for the last several years I had shrunken inside myself. Now as I started doubting and even hating the school and other Christians around me, I felt myself coming back to life. One night something snapped. Richard attended a Sunday evening service where he heard the usual testimonies and praise, but one report in particular rankled him. Earlier that week, a plane carrying 9 missionaries had crashed in the Alaskan outback, killing all aboard. The pastor solemnly related the details and introduced a member of the church who had survived an unrelated plane crash that same week. When the church member finished describing his narrow escape, the congregation responded, "Praise the Lord! Lord, we thank you for bringing our brother to safety and for having your guardian angels watch over him," the pastor prayed. "And please be with the families of those who died in Alaska." That prayer triggered revulsion, something like nausea, in Richard. You can't have it both ways, he thought. If God gets credit for the survivor, he should also get blamed for the casualties. Yet churches never hear testimonies from the grievers. What would the spouses of the dead missionaries say? Would they talk about a loving father? Richard returned to his apartment, greatly agitated. Everything was coming to a head around one question. Is God even there? He had not seen convincing evidence. Richard interrupted his story at this point. The sun had strayed behind a large building to the west, gauzily softening the room's shadows and streaks of light. Richard closed his eyes and chewed on his lower lip. He pressed on his eyes with his thumbs hard. He seemed to be setting a mental picture as if to get it just right. "What happened next?" I asked, after a few minutes of silence. "Was that the night you lost your faith?" He nodded and resumed speaking, but in a subdued tone. "I stayed up late that night, long after my neighbors had gone to bed. I live on a quiet street in the suburbs, and it seemed like I was alone in the world. I sensed something important was about to happen. I was hurt. So many times God had let me down. I hated God, and yet I was afraid too. I was a theology student, right? Maybe God was there and I had it all wrong. How could I know? I went back over my whole Christian experience from the very beginning. I remembered the first flush of faith at the university. I was young then and vulnerable. Maybe I had just learned a few upbeat phrases and talked myself into believing in an abundant life. Maybe I'd been mimicking other people and living off their experiences. Had I deluded myself about God? Still, I hesitated to cast aside all that I believed. I felt I had to give God one last chance. I prayed that night as earnestly and sincerely as I knew how. I prayed on my knees, and I prayed stretched out flat on the oak floor. God, do you care? I prayed. I don't want to tell you how to run your world, but please give me some sign that you're really there. That's all I ask. For 4 years I'd been straining for a personal relationship with God, as the phrase goes, and yet God had treated me worse than any of my friends. Now everything narrowed down to one final question. How can you have a personal relationship if you're not sure the other person even exists? With God I could never be sure. I prayed for at least 4 hours. At times I felt foolish, at times utterly sincere. I had the sensation of stepping off a ledge in the darkness with no idea where I might land. That was up to God. Finally, at 4 o'clock in the morning, I came to my senses. Nothing had happened. God had not responded. Why continue torturing myself? Why not just forget God and get on with your life? Get on with life, like most of the rest of the world. Instantly, I felt a sense of relief and freedom, like I had just passed a final exam or gotten my first driver's license. The struggle was over. My life was my own. It seems silly now, but this is what I did next. I picked up my Bible and a couple of other Christian books and walked downstairs and out the back door. I shut the door softly behind me so as not to wake anyone. In the backyard was a brick barbecue grill, and I piled the books on it, sprayed them with lighter fluid, and struck a match. It was a moonless light, and the flames danced high and bright. Bible verses and bits of theology curled, blackened, then broke off in tiny crumbs of ash and floated skyward. My faith was going up with them. I made another trip upstairs and brought down another armload of books. I did this maybe 8 times over the next hour. Commentaries, seminary textbooks, the rough draft of my book on Job, all of them went up in smoke. I might have burned every book I owned if I hadn't been interrupted by an angry fireman and a yellow rain slicker who ran towards me shouting, "What do you think you're doing?" Someone had phoned in an alarm. I fumbled around for an excuse, and I finally told him I was just burning trash. After the fireman had squirted some chemicals on my bonfire and shoveled dirt over it, he let me go. I climbed the stairs and sank into bed, smelling of smoke. It was almost dawn by then, and at last I had peace. A great weight had lifted. I'd been honest with myself. Any pretense was gone, and I no longer felt the pressure to believe what I could never be sure of. I felt converted, but converted from God. I'm glad I don't make my living as a professional counselor. When I sit across from someone spilling his guts like Richard did, I never know what to say. I said little that afternoon, and maybe that was best. It would not have helped for me to find fault with the tests Richard had devised for God. He seemed especially concerned about the book on Job, due out next week within the next few weeks. The publisher knew about his change of heart, he said, but the first edition was already on the presses. I assured him my endorsement of the book still held. It was the content of the book I was endorsing more than his personal attachment. Besides, I've certainly changed my mind about some things I've written in the last 10 years, I told him. Richard was exhausted after talking so long, but he seemed more relaxed as he stood to leave. Maybe all my problems started with my study of Job, he said. I used to love Job. He wasn't afraid to be honest with God. He took God on. I guess the difference between us is what happened at the end. God came through for Job after all his pain. He didn't come through for me. Dusk had fallen, and a photo cell had already switched on the stairway lights. As Richard shook my hand and disappeared down the steps, I felt very sad. He was young and tanned and healthy. Some would say he had no real reason to despair, but listening to him, watching his hands clenching and the lines of tension in his face, I'd recognized at last the source of his rage. Richard was feeling a pain as great as that of any any that a human being experiences, the pain of betrayal, the pain of a lover who wakes up and suddenly realizes it's all over. He had staked his life on God, and God had let him down. Chapter 3, The Questions No One Asks Aloud. Sometimes the most important questions, those that float in vague suspension for much of our lives, can crystallize in a single moment. Richard's visit provided such a moment for me. In one respect, his complaints, broken home, health problems, failed romance, lost job, hardly ranked as for world-class disappointments. And yet that night by the barbecue grill he had, with theatrical finality, acted on the doubts that plague almost all of us. Does God really care? If so, why won't he reach down and fix the things that go wrong, at least some of them? Absorbed in his anger and pain, Richard had not given voice to his doubts in a systematic way. He experienced them more as feelings of betrayal than as matters of faith. As I brooded over our conversation, however, I kept returning to three large questions about God that seemed to lurk just behind the thicket of his feelings. The longer I pondered them, the more I realized that these questions are lodged somewhere inside of all of us. Yet few people ask them aloud, for they seem at best impolite, at worst heretical. Is God unfair? Richard had tried to follow God, but his life fell apart anyway. He could not reconcile his miseries with the biblical promises of rewards and happiness. And what about the people who openly deny God yet prosper anyway? This is an old complaint, as old as Job and the Psalms, but it remains a stumbling block to faith. Is God silent? 3 times as he faced crucial choices in his education, career, and romance, Richard begged God for clear direction. Each time he thought he had God's will figured out, only to have that choice lead to failure. What kind of father is he? Richard asked. Does he enjoy watching me fall on my face? I was told that God loves me and has a wonderful plan for my life. Fine. So why doesn't he tell me what that plan is? Is God hidden? This question, above all, obsessed Richard. It seemed to him an irreducible minimum, a theological bottom line, that God should somehow prove himself. How can I have a relationship with a person I'm not even sure exists? Yet it seemed that God deliberately hid himself, even from people who sought him out. And when Richard's late-night vigil provoked no response, he simply gave up on God. I thought about these 3 questions often on a subsequent writing assignment in South America. In Peru, a missionary pilot flew me to a small Shipibo Indian village. He landed the float plane, taxied to the riverbank, and guided me along a jungle trail to the main street in town, a dirt path surrounded by a dozen huts built on stilts and covered with palm frond roofs. He had brought me there to show me a thriving 40-year-old church, but he also showed me a granite marker just off the main path and told me the story of the young missionary who had helped found that church. When his 6-month-old son died from onset of vomiting and diarrhea, the young missionary seemed to crack. He hewed a marker by hand from local stone, the marker we were looking at, buried the baby's body, and planted a tree beside the grave. At the hottest part of each day, when everyone else sought shade, the missionary walked to the river and hauled back a jug of water for the tree. Then he stood beside the grave, his shadow falling across it, as if to shield it from the blazing equatorial sun. Sometimes he would weep, sometimes pray, and sometimes just stand there with a vacant gaze. His wife, the Indian church members, and other missionaries all tried to comfort him, but to no avail. Eventually the missionary himself got sick. His mind wandered. He had constant diarrhea. He was flown to Lima, where doctors probed him for any sign of amoeba or other tropical organisms, but they found nothing. None of the drugs they tried were effective. They diagnosed his problem as hysterical diarrhea and sent him and his wife back to the United States. As I stood beside the crumbling granite marker which the Indian women now used as a place to rest their water pots, I tried to put myself in that young missionary's place. I wondered what he had prayed as he stood there in the noonday sun, and Richard's 3 questions kept coming to mind. My guide had said the man was tormented by the question of unfairness. His baby had done nothing wrong. The missionary brought his family to serve God in the jungle. What was their reward? He had also prayed for some sign of God's presence, or at least a word of comfort, but he felt none. As if distrustful of God's own sympathy, the missionary took on a form of sympathetic suffering in his own body. True atheists do not, I presume, feel disappointed in God. They expect nothing and receive nothing. But those who commit their lives to God, no matter what, instinctively expect something in return. Are those expectations wrong? I did not see my friend Richard for a long time. I prayed for him regularly, but all my efforts to contact him proved futile. His phone had been disconnected, and I heard he had moved out of the area. His publisher eventually sent me a copy of his book on Job, and it sat on my shelf as a potent warning against writing too hastily on matters of faith. Then one day, about 3 years later, I bumped into Richard in downtown Chicago. He looked good. By putting on a little weight and letting his hair grow a few inches longer, he had lost the haunted, severe mien. He seemed glad to see me, and we scheduled a lunch. Last time I met with you, I guess I was in the pits, he said, with a smile as he joined me in a Mexican restaurant a few days later. Life is treating me much better now. He had a promising job and had long since put the failed romance behind him. Soon our conversation turned to God, and it quickly became evident that Richard had not fully recovered. A thick scab of cynicism now covered the wounds, but he was as angry at God as ever. The waitress poured a fresh cup of coffee, and Richard wrapped both hands around the cup and stared at the dark, steaming liquid. "I've gained some perspective on that crazy period," he said. "I think I've figured out what went wrong. I can tell you the exact hour and minute I began doubting God, and it wasn't at Wheaton or in my room that night I was stayed up praying." He then related an incident that had occurred very early in his Christian life. "One thing bugged me from the very beginning, the notion of faith. It seemed a black hole that could gobble up any honest question. I'd ask the InterVarsity leader about the problem of pain, and he would spout something about faith. 'Believe God whether you feel like it or not,' he'd say. 'The feelings will follow.' I faked it, but I can now see that the feelings never followed. I was just going through the motions. Even back then, when I was searching for hard evidence of God as an alternative to faith, and one day I found it, on television of all places, while randomly flipping a dial. I came across a mass healing service being conducted by Catherine Coleman. I watched for a few minutes as she brought various people up on the stage and interviewed them. Each one told an amazing story of supernatural healing, cancer, heart conditions, paralysis. It was like a medical encyclopedia up there. As I watched Coleman's program, my doubts gradually melted away. At last I had found something real and tangible. Coleman asked a musician to sing her favorite song. He touched me. That's what I needed, I thought, a touch, a personal touch from God. She held out that promise, and I lunged for it. 3 weeks later, when Catherine Coleman came to a neighboring state, I skipped classes and traveled half a day to attend one of her meetings. The atmosphere was unbelievably changed. Soft organ music in the background, the murmuring sound of people praying aloud, some in strange tongues, and every few minutes a happy interruption when someone would stand and claim, "I'm healed!" One person especially made an impression, a man from Milwaukee who had been carried into the meeting on a stretcher. When he walked, yes, walked on stage, we all cheered wildly. He told us he was a physician. I was even more impressed. He had incurable lung cancer, he said, and he was told he had 6 months to live. But now, tonight, he believed God had healed him. He was walking for the first time in months. He felt great. Praise God. I wrote down the man's name and practically floated out of that meeting. I had never known such certainty of faith before. My search was over. I had seen proof of a living God in those people on the stage. If he could work tangible miracles in them, then surely he had something wonderful in store for me. I went in contact with the man of faith I had seen at the meeting, so much so that exactly 1 week later I phoned directory assistants in Milwaukee and got the physician's number. When I dialed, a woman answered the phone. "May I please speak to Dr. S?" I said. Long silence. "Who are you?" she said at last. I figured she was just screening calls from the patients or something. I gave my name, told her I admired Dr. S, and had wanted to talk to him ever since the Catherine Coleman meeting. I'd been very moved by his story, I said. Another long silence. Then she spoke in a flat voice, pronouncing each word slowly. "My husband is dead." Just that one sentence, nothing more, and she hung up. I can't tell you how that devastated me. I was wasted. I half staggered into the next room, where my sister was sitting. "Richard, what's wrong?" she asked. "Are you all right?" No, I was not all right, but I couldn't talk about it. I was crying. My mother and sister tried to pry some explanation out of me, but what could I tell them? For me, the certainty I had staked my life on had died with that phone call. A flame had flared bright for one fine shining week and then gone dark like a dying star. Richard stared into his coffee cup. Marimba music playing in the background sounded tinny and jarringly loud. "I don't quite understand," I said. "That happened long before you went to Wheaton and got a theology degree and wrote a book." "Yeah, but it all started back then," he interrupted. "Everything that followed, Wheaton, the book on Job, the Bible study groups, was a grasping attempt to prove wrong what I should have learned from that one phone call. Nobody's out there, Philip. And if by some chance God does exist, then he's toying with us. Why doesn't he quit playing games and show himself?" Richard soon changed the topic of conversation, and we spent the rest of the lunch catching up on the past 3 years. He kept insisting that he was happy. He may have been protesting too strongly, but he did indeed seem more content. Toward the end, as we were digging into our ice cream desserts, he brought up our last meeting 3 years before. "You must have thought I was half crazy, charging in there and blurting out my whole life story when I'd never even met you." "Not at all," I said. "In a strange sort of way, I've never been able to get that conversation out of my mind. Actually, your complaints against God helped me better understand my own." I then told Richard about the 3 questions. After I had explained them, I asked if they summed up his complaints against God. "Well, my doubt was more like a feeling. I felt jilted, like God had strung me along just to watch me fall. But you're right. As I think about it, those questions were behind my feelings. God was certainly unfair, and he always seemed hidden and silent. Yeah, that's it. That's it exactly, he said. Why on earth doesn't God answer those questions? Richard had raised his voice and was waving his arms like a politician. Like an evangelist. Fortunately, the restaurant had emptied. If only God answered those questions. If only he answered one of them. If, say, he would just speak aloud one time so that everyone would hear, then I would believe. Probably the whole world would believe. Why doesn't he? Chapter 4, What If? If only, Richard had said, if only God solved those three problems, then faith would flourish like flowers in springtime, wouldn't it? The same year I met Richard in the Mexican restaurant, I happened to be studying the books of Exodus and Numbers, and even though Richard's questions were still buzzing about my mind, it took a while for me to notice a curious parallel. Then one day it suddenly jumped out from the page. Exodus described the very world Richard wanted. It showed God stepping into human history almost daily. He acted with utter fairness and spoke so that everyone could hear. Behold, he even made himself visible. The contrast between the days of the Israelites and our days, the 20th century, got me thinking about how God runs the world, and I went back to the three questions. If God had the power to act fairly, speak audibly, and appear visibly, why then does he seem so reluctant to intervene today? Perhaps the record of the Israelites in the wilderness contained a clue. Question. Is God unfair? Why doesn't he consistently punish evil people and reward good people? Why do awful things happen to people, good and bad, with no discernible pattern? Imagine a world designed so that we experience a mild jolt of pain with every sin and a tickle of pleasure with every act of virtue. Imagine a world in which every errant doctrine attracts a lightning bolt, while every repetition of the Apostles' Creed stimulates our brains to produce an endorphin of pleasure. The Old Testament records a behavior modification experiment almost that blatant. God's covenant with the Israelites. In the Sinai desert, God resolved to reward and punish his people with strict legislative fairness. He signed the guarantee with his own hand, making it independent on the one condition that the Israelites had to follow the laws he laid down. He then had Moses outline the terms of this guarantee to the people. Okay, you see here. We have results of obedience, prosperous cities and rural areas. No sterility among men, women, or livestock. Assured success in farming. Dependable weather conditions. Guaranteed military victories. Total immunity to diseases. Results of disobedience. Violence, crime, and poverty everywhere. Infertility among people and livestock. Crop failure. Locusts and worms. Scorching heat. Drought, blight, and mildew. Domination by other nations. Fever and inflammation. Madness, blindness, confusion of mind. If they were obedient, Moses said, God would set them high above the nations on earth. They would always be at the top, never at the bottom. In effect, the Israelites were promised protection from virtually every kind of human misery and disappointment. On the other hand, if they disobeyed, they would become a thing of horror and an object of scorn and ridicule to all the nations where the Lord will drive you, because you did not serve the Lord your God joyfully and gladly in the time of prosperity. Therefore, in hunger and thirst, in nakedness and dire poverty, you will serve the enemies the Lord sends against you. I read on, scanning the books of Joshua and Judges to see the results of this covenant based on a fair system of rewards and punishment. Within 50 years, the Israelites had disintegrated into a state of utter anarchy. Much of the rest of the Old Testament recounts the dreary history of the predicted curses, not blessings, coming true. Despite all the lavish benefits of the covenant, Israel failed to obey God and meet its terms. Years later, when New Testament authors looked back on that history, they did not hold up the covenant as an exemplary model of God relating to his people with absolute consistency and fairness. Rather, they said the Old Covenant served as an object lesson, demonstrating that human beings were incapable of fulfilling a contract with God. It seemed clear to them that the New Covenant, or Testament, with God was needed, one based on forgiveness and grace, and that is precisely why the New Testament exists. Question: is God silent? If he is so concerned about our doing his will, why doesn't he reveal that will more plainly? Various people claim to hear the word of God today. Some of them are crazy, like the wild man who, on God's orders, attacked Michelangelo's Pietà with a hammer, or the political assassin who claimed God told him to shoot the president. Others seem sincere but misguided, like the 6 strangers who reported to author Joni Eareckson that God had instructed them to marry her. Still, others seem to carry on the authentic tradition of the prophets and apostles, delivering the word of God to his people. So then how can we know whether what we have heard is truly a word from God? God simplified matters of guidance. I discovered when the Israelites camped in the Sinai wilderness, should we pack up our tent and move today, or stay put? For the answer, an inquisitive Israelite need only glance at the cloud over the tabernacle. If the cloud moved, God wanted his people to move. If it stayed, that meant stay. You could conveniently check God's will around the clock. At night, the cloud glowed like a tower of fire. God set up other ways, like the casting of lots and the Urim and Thummim, to directly communicate his will, but most issues were pre-decided. He had spoken his will for the Israelites in a set of rules, codified into 613 laws that covered the complete range of behavior, from murder to boiling a young goat in its mother's milk. Few people complained about fuzzy guidance in those days. But did a clear word from God increase the likelihood of obedience? Apparently not. Do you go up and fight the Amorites? Said God. Do not go up and fight the Amorites, said God, because I will not be with you. You will be defeated by your enemies. The Israelites promptly went up and fought the Amorites and were defeated by their enemies. They marched when told to sit tight, fled in fear when told to march, fought when told to declared peace when told to fight. They made a national pastime out of inventing ways to break the 613 commands. Clear guidance became as much of an affront to that generation as unclear guidance is to ours. I also noticed a telling pattern in the Old Testament accounts. The very clarity of God's will had a stunting effect on the Israelites' faith. Why pursue God when he had already revealed himself so clearly? Why step out in faith when God had already guaranteed the results? Why wrestle with the dilemma of conflicting choices when God had already resolved the dilemma? In short, why should the Israelites act like adults when they could act like children? And act like children they did, grumbling against their leaders, cheating on the strict rules governing manna, whining about every food or water shortage. As I studied the story of the Israelites, I had second thoughts about crystal clear guidance. It may serve some purpose. It may, for example, get a mob of just freed slaves across a hostile desert, but it does not seem to encourage spiritual development. In fact, for the Israelites, it nearly eliminated the need for faith at all. Clear guidance sucked away freedom, making every choice a matter of obedience rather than faith. And in 40 years of wilderness wanderings, the Israelites flunked the obedience test so badly that God was forced to start over with a new generation. Question: is God hidden? Why doesn't he simply show up sometimes, visibly, and dumbfound the skeptics once and for all? What the Soviet cosmonaut wanted when he looked for God in the dark void outside a spacecraft window, what my friend Richard wanted, alone in his room at 2 a.m, is the hungering desire of our age, for those who still hunger. We want proof, evidence, a personal appearance, so that the God we have heard about becomes the God we see. What we hunger for happened once. For a time, God did show up in person, and a man spoke to him face to face as he might speak with a friend. They met together, God and Moses, in a tent pitched just outside the Israelite camp. The rendezvous was no secret. Whenever Moses trudged over to the tent to talk to God, the whole camp turned out to watch. A pillar of cloud, God's visible presence, blocked the entrance to the tent. No one except Moses knew what transpired inside. No one wanted to know. The Israelites had learned to keep their distance. Speak to us yourself, and we will listen, they said to Moses. But do not have God speak to us, or we will die. After each meeting, Moses would emerge glowing like a space alien, and the people turned their faces away until he covered himself with a veil. There were few, if any, atheists in those days. No Israelites wrote plays about waiting for a God who never arrived. They could see clear evidence of God outside the tent to meet him, or in the thick storm clouds hovering around Mount Sinai. A skeptic need only hike over to the trembling mountain and reach out a hand to touch it, and his doubts would vanish 1 second before he did. And yet what happened during those days almost defies belief. When Moses climbed the sacred mountain stormy with the signs of God's presence, Those people who had lived through the 10 plagues of Egypt, who had crossed the Red Sea on dry ground, who had drunk water from a rock, who were digesting the miracle of manna in their stomachs at that moment, those same people got bored or impatient or rebellious or jealous and apparently forgot all about their God. By the time Moses descended from the mountain, they were dancing like heathens around a golden calf. God did not play hide and seek with the Israelites. They had every proof of his existence you could ask for, but astonishingly, and I could hardly believe this result even as I read it, God's directness seemed to produce the very opposite of the desired effect. The Israelites responded not with worship and love, but with fear and open rebellion. God's visible presence did nothing to improve lasting faith. I had distilled Richard's complaints about God into 3 questions, but Exodus and Numbers taught me that quick solutions to those 3 questions may not solve the underlying problems of disappointment with God. The Israelites, though exposed to the bright, unshaded light of God's presence, were as fickle a people as have ever lived. 10 different times on the melancholy, pathless plains of the Sinai they rose up against God. Even at the very border of the promised land, with all its bounty stretching out before them, they were still keening for the good old days of slavery in Egypt. These dismal results may provide insight into why God does not intervene more directly today. Some Christians long for a world well stocked with miracles and spectacular signs of God's presence. I hear wistful sermons on the parting of the Red Sea and the 10 plagues and the daily manna in the wilderness, as if the speakers yearn for God to unleash his power like that today. But the follow-the-dots journey of the Israelites would give us pause. Would a burst of miracles nourish faith? Not the kind of faith God seems interested in, evidently. The Israelites give ample proof that signs may only addict us to signs, not to God. True, the Israelites were a primitive people emerging out of slavery, but the biblical accounts have a disturbingly familiar ring to them. The Israelites tended to behave, in Frederick Buechner's phrase, just like everybody else, only more so. I came away from my study of them both surprised and confused. Surprised to learn how little difference it made in people's lives when 3 major reasons for disappointment with God, unfairness, silence, and hiddenness, were removed. Confused by the questions stirred up about God's actions on earth. Has he changed? Has he pulled back, withdrawn? As Richard sat in my living room telling me his story that first time, he had looked up suddenly and said in a fierce voice, "God doesn't know what the hell he's doing with his world." What is God doing? What is the human experiment all about? What does he want from us after all? And what can we expect from him? And here's a quote by Frederick Buechner. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing his name right. He says, "Without somehow destroying me in the process, how could God reveal himself in a way that would leave no room for doubt? If there were no room for doubt, there'd be no room for me." Chapter 5. The Source. For 2 weeks I holed up in a Colorado cabin to ponder Richard's 3 questions in light of what I had seen in the Old Testament. I brought along a suitcase full of books to study, but during my entire time there I only opened a Bible. I started at Genesis late the first afternoon, a day of heavy snowfall. It was perfect setting for reading the story of creation. Clouds lifted in time for spectacular Clouds lifted in time for a spectacular alpenglow sunset with puffs of snow pluming off the tops of the mountain peaks like pink cotton candy. At night the clouds closed in again and snow blew furiously. I read straight through the Bible, slowly, cover to cover. By the time I reached Deuteronomy, snow covered the bottom step. When I hit the prophets, it had crept up the mailbox post. And when I finally made it to Revelation, I had to call for a snowplow to unbury the driveway. Over 72 inches of fresh powder fell during the 2 weeks I spent in a loft reading the Bible and looking out the window at sugar-coated evergreens. It struck me forcefully that our common impressions of God may be very different from the God of the Bible. I need to try that sentence again. It struck me forcefully there that our common impressions of God may be very different from the God the Bible actually portrays. What is he really like? In church and at Christian college, I had learned to think of God as an unchanging, invisible spirit who possesses such qualities as omnipotence, omniscience, and impassibility, incapable of emotion. These doctrines, which are supposed to help us understand God's point of view, can be found in the Bible, but they are well buried. Simply reading the Bible, I encountered not a misty vapor, but an actual person. A person as unique and distinctive and colorful as any person I know. God has deep emotions. He feels delight and frustration and anger. In the prophets, he weeps and moans with pain, even comparing himself to a woman giving birth. I cry out, I gasp and pant. Again and again, God is shocked by the behavior of human beings. When the Israelites commit infant sacrifice, he seems stunned by actions which, an omniscient God is speaking here, I did not command or mention, nor did it enter in my mind. He explains the need to punish by asking plaintively, what else can I do? I know the word I know the word anthropomorphism is supposed to explain all those human-like characteristics, but surely the images God borrows from human experience point to an even stronger reality. As I read through the Bible in my winter airy, I marveled at how much God lets human beings affect him. I was unprepared for the joy and the anguish, in short, the passion of the God of the universe. By studying about God, by taming him and reducing him to words and concepts that could be filed away in alphabetical order, I had lost the force of the passionate relationship God seeks above all else. The people who related to God best, Abraham, Moses, David, Isaiah, Jeremiah, treated him with startling familiarity. They talked to God as if he were sitting in a chair beside them, as one might talk to a counselor, a boss, a parent, or a lover. They treated him like a person. That Colorado trip put my 3 questions about disappointment with God in a new light. They're not puzzles awaiting solution, such as you would encounter in the field of mathematics or computer programming or even philosophy. Rather, they are problems of relationship between human beings and a God who wants desperately to love and be loved by us. I saw a few people during my 2-week retreat. Mostly I huddled indoors behind the wall of snow and read. Perhaps it was this aloneness, this isolation, that cleared the way for the conclusion that I reached. I had always considered just one point of view, the human point of view. I have shelves full of books presenting the dilemma of being human. Some are funny, some anguished, some sarcastic, some densely philosophical, but all express the same basic viewpoint. Here's what it feels like to be a human being. People disappointed with God likewise focus on the human point of view. When we ask our questions, why is God unfair, silent, hidden? We're really asking, why is God unfair to me? Why does he seem silent with me and hidden from me? I tried to set aside my existential questions, my personal disappointments, and consider instead God's point of view. Why does he seek contact with human beings in the first place? What is he pursuing in us, and what interferes with that pursuit? I turned to the Bible again, trying to hear God's words as if for the first time. He speaks for himself there, and I realized that I had not often paid attention. I'd been too preoccupied with my feelings to listen attentively to his feelings. I came away from Colorado with a very different mental image of God. After 2 weeks of studying the Bible, I had a strong sense that God doesn't care so much about being analyzed. Mainly, he wants to be loved. Nearly every page of his word rustles with this message, and I returned home knowing I must somehow explore the relationship between a passionate God, hungry for the love of his people, and the people themselves. All feelings of disappointment with God trace back to a breakdown in that relationship. Thus I determined to look for the answer to a question I had never before considered. What does it feel like to be God? And then here's a quote by Herman Melville. Herman Melville's the guy who wrote the book, what is the name of that book? It's the book about that fish, the big fish. Oh my goodness, I can't think of the name of it. Anyway, he says, the reason the mass of men fear God, and at bottom dislike him, is because they rather distrust his heart, and fancy him all brain like a watch. That's by Herman Melville. Okay. Well, that's the end of part 1, and I will stop here, and I will be recording another one next time. I love you. Bye.